Welcome to AP Biology. Today's presentation is going to be on mechanisms that can isolate populations of the same species that can eventually lead to speciation. So one of the stories of the Galapagos Islands is that these islands are very different from one another. So when islands first form, like here, Fernandina's in the process of forming right now, this thing, it looks green in the picture, but it is completely black lava covering the whole island. Isabella is about 1 million years old, and so it has regions on it that are becoming fairly vegetated. Right. Santiago and Santa Cruz are a couple million years old, and they are pretty much rainforests on the top. The reason these guys become rainforests is they're so tall that as the moist air hits the windward side, it goes up and condenses like a sponge, and it squishes all the moisture out of the air, and so it rains a lot, especially on Santiago and Santa Cruz, but Isabella as well too. And so these end up being rainforests like on the top and more desert like along the edges. And then the real flat islands like Espanola and San Cristobal and Genovesa, those islands are super flat because they're old and they've been worn. Erosion has worn them down to only being like maybe 50 or 60 feet above sea level. And so they are super dry. They have hardly any rain that ever falls on them, and very desert like conditions in those areas. So, because you have such different conditions on the different islands, you have different food sources for birds to adapt to, and so that's why we see such differences in the finch populations. Also, this distance, although it doesn't look very far, is quite a ways. So from here to here, that's about 70 miles. So not quite as wide as Lake Michigan, but you cannot see across. So if a bird is living on Isabella Island, it cannot see Santiago. And so it has no idea something's over there. Really, the only way birds get from one island to the other is when storms hit, and they get caught in storms and they end up landing on other islands. But other than that, it's pretty rare that one's just going to take off and fly to another island because it's so far away. So, what are some things that can isolate species? Well, one of the things that can isolate a species is geography. So, if a mountain range forms between two species, that can have an isolating effect. When we have organisms uh, becoming different species in different locations, we call it allopatric speciation. There's another type of speciation called sympatric speciation we'll talk about later on. But allopatric means you're in different locations adapting to different local environments, and so you become different over time. Another place where we see geographic isolation is the Grand Canyon. On one edge of the Grand Canyon, this particular squirrel has adapted different characteristics than on the other edge of the Grand Canyon. They are the same, they were the same species. Genetically, they're almost identical when you look at their genes, but they won't interbreed with each other anymore, so we call them separate species. These frogs are seasonally isolated. So we have a northern leopard frog and a southern leopard frog, and they mate at totally different times of the year. So they mate based on day length, but the temperature is different in the south when you hit a certain day length than it is in the north. So in April, it's pretty darn warm down in Florida. That's why everybody goes down to Florida for spring break. So the southern leopard frogs, they start breeding in April. The northern leopard frogs don't start breeding until late May, early June. And so it's a totally different breeding season. And if you bring a southern leopard frog up north or a northern leopard frog down south, they actually become fertile at different times of the year based on day length. And so these two species can no longer interbreed with one another. Even though I'm sure they came from the same species, they've adapted to different environmental conditions, and so they can no longer interbreed. This is called ecological isolation. Grizzly bears and polar bears live in different ecosystems. They can still interbreed and produce fertile offspring, but they never do because they don't live in the same locations anymore. Well, I shouldn't say never. We get roller bears every once in a while, but they rarely do. This is two types of iguanas that we find in the Galapagos Islands. One of them is adapted to land, and the other one's adapted to sea. And so they live in different parts of the ecology. This one, the land iguana, lives in the desert regions where there's lots of cactus pads and things to eat. And the other one lives along the shore on the lava banks, and it gets almost all of its nutrients from the sea. It dives into the water and eats algae and stuff that's growing on the sea, in the sea. Another way to isolate yourself reproductively is through behavior. Certain finches the cactus finch will make its nest in a cactus, and the ground finch will make its nest on the ground. And so, in order to attract females like nests and where they're supposed to be. And so, these nest up in the cactuses pretty much just attract cactus finch, and the ground finches are attracted to a different type of nest. In some species, you got to have the right characteristics and the right features and do the right dance in order to attract females of your species. In some species, you have to sing the correct song. So even though western and eastern meadowlarks probably could still interbreed, they don't because they've been separated for long enough that they no longer sing the same breeding songs. And so if you don't know the right song, it's hard to meet a mate. And then the last one, reproductive isolation. The last type of reproductive isolation is mechanical, and that's where you have two species that just don't interbreed because, well, for example, orchids put the pollen on the top of the bee, and normal flowers put the pollen on the bottom. And so they never really come in contact with the female part of the flower, and so they don't hybridize. Another mechanical situation would be one individual of a particular species so much larger than another individual of a particular species, okay, that interbreeding would not happen. And then we said earlier we're going to talk about sympatric. Sympatric means that organisms live in the same area and they develop new species in the same area. So they do this by niche partitioning. So some of these species will be bottom feeders. Some of these species will be surface feeders. Some of these species will feed in the shallow. Some species will feed in the deep part of the lake. So by niche partitioning, they end up being near other individuals similar to themselves, so they end up breeding with those individuals.